Hello, welcome back to MOOC course on Environmental Humanities. I hope you are enjoying listening to the lectures. We are in week 3 and this is lecture number 12 of the course. In the previous lecture, we examined how climate fiction represents environmental crisis, human responsibility and ecological change through narrative. We explored how novels can make large-scale environmental issues visible by connecting them to human experiences, emotions and everyday life. Today, in this discussion, we will focus on how important relationship within environmental humanities are. For example, the connection between the domesticity and planetary change. While climate change is often discussed as a global phenomenon, literary texts remind us that environmental issues are also closely connected to homes, households, livelihoods, and daily practices. Through the selected climate fiction texts, we will examine how everyday domestic life contributes to the environmental change, how global ecological crises affect households and communities. So here are the points that are going to be important in discussion. Discussions on, you can see the title slide, climate change is often understood as a global or planetary crisis. Discussions on environmental issues frequently focus on rising temperatures, biodiversity loss, extreme weather events, and large-scale ecological transformations affecting the entire planet. But it is not only at global level. It is also connected to everyday life. The choices people make within households, the resources they consume, the technologies they use, and the ways they interact with, and the surroundings all contribute to broader environmental processes. So, the global and the local are deeply interconnected. Environmental humanities tells us to examine the relationship between domestic spaces and planetary systems. Homes and households may appear small when compared to global environmental challenges, yet they are important sites where environmental values, habits and practices are formed and reproduced. The literary texts discussed in this lecture illustrate this connection in different ways. They show how climate change influences daily life while also revealing how everyday practices can contribute to larger ecological problems. By examining these texts, we can better understand the relationship between individual actions, global environmental change. So this will help us move beyond seeing climate change as a distant issue and will encourage us to recognize its presence in our surroundings. So first is domesticity, the term that you can see on the screen. Domesticity refers to the sphere of home, household, family life and everyday practices. It includes activities that people perform on a daily basis, such as caring for family members, managing resources, preparing food, earning livelihoods, and making decisions about consumption. Because these activities are part of ordinary life, they are often taken for granted and may not immediately appear connected to environmental concerns. However, domestic spaces are important because they represent the most immediate level at which people interact with their environment. Many environmental decisions are made within households, whether consciously or unconsciously. Choices related to energy use, water consumption, food practices, transportation, and waste generation all emerge from everyday domestic routines. From the perspective of environmental humanities, domesticity is significant because it allows us to see how large environmental issues become part of everyday life. Climate change is not experienced only through global reports and scientific data. It is also encountered through living conditions, economic pressures, and our day-to-day experiences. In literature, domestic spaces often function as sites where broader social and environmental issues become visible. Through family life and everyday routines, writers can show how environmental change affects individuals at a personal level. Domesticity therefore represents a micro level perspective, focusing on the intimate and immediate spaces through which people experience the world around them. So, domesticity helps us understand environmental issues at the level of our day to day life, the mundane, and it must be viewed alongside larger environmental systems and processes. Now we turn to another thing, and that is planetary or global processes. Look at these two words, planetary or global processes. They refer to something large scale environmental changes and systems that affect the earth as a whole. These include climate change, global warming, biodiversity loss, ecological degradation, and other environmental transformations that occur across regions, nations, and continents. Unlike domestic practices, these processes operate on a large scale that extends far beyond individual households. Such environmental changes are influenced by complex interactions between political decisions, economic systems, technological developments, industrial activities, and global patterns of consumption. As a result, climate change cannot be understood solely through individual actions. It is also shaped by larger structures operating at national and international levels. At first glance, domesticity and planetary processes may appear separate. One focuses on everyday life, while the other concerns global environmental systems. However, environmental humanities emphasizes that these two levels are deeply interconnected. Household activities contribute to larger environmental patterns, while global environmental changes directly influence homes, livelihoods, and communities. This connection is particularly important in climate fiction. Many novels demonstrate how large-scale environmental crises become visible through everyday experiences. Through individual characters and households, readers are able to observe the effects of broader ecological transformations. Understanding this relationship between the micro and macro levels allows us to see climate change not as a distant phenomenon but as a process that connects global systems with everyday life. Now let us move on. Now we have seen the relationship between domestic life and planetary processes. We need to examine how domesticity contributes to environmental change in the selected literary texts. Now we again come back to the texts, Janet Winterson's The Stone Gods, which presents one of the most direct critiques of environmentally unsustainable domestic life. The novel depicts a society driven by consumerism, technological dependence, and the pursuit of comfort. Everyday life on the planet of Orbis is characterized by excessive resource consumption and artificial living environments. What is particularly significant is that these practices have become normalized. People continue their routines without questioning the ecological consequences of their actions. Through the repeated collapse of civilizations, Winterson suggests that unsustainable domestic habits can accumulate over time and contribute to large-scale environmental destruction. A similar connection between everyday life and environmental change appears in Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior. Unlike the futuristic setting of the Stone Gods, this novel focuses on a rural household, which I told in the previous lecture also, and its relationship with the natural environment. Farming practices, economic struggles, and limited access to scientific knowledge all influence how characters respond to climate-related changes. The unexpected arrival of monarch butterflies serves as a visible reminder that global environmental processes can directly affect local communities. An important aspect of the novel is the tension between scientific explanations and everyday perceptions. An important aspect of the novel is the tension between scientific explanations and everyday perceptions. While climate change is a global phenomenon, people often understand it through the realities of their daily lives. Kingsolver therefore demonstrates how domestic experiences shape environmental awareness, because what we see on a day-to-day basis, We start perceiving the environmental problems through those experiences, and therefore it also forms a kind of awareness and responses to the ecological changes. These texts reveal that domesticity is not separate from environmental issues. Everyday habits, patterns of consumption, and household practices all contribute to broader ecological transformation. Now, when you look at these two novels, this becomes even more clear. Because in these two novels also, this relationship between domesticity and environment and the planetary scale can be visualized. In The Rapture, the domestic spaces appear to function normally despite growing signs of ecological instability. Family routines, social interactions, and everyday activities continue as environmental catastrophe, and it becomes increasingly apparent. This contrast is significant because it highlights a common feature of climate change: the tendency to ignore environmental warnings while maintaining familiar patterns of life. Through Bettany's visions and unfolding crisis, the novel reveals a disconnect between everyday human concerns and larger ecological realities. It suggests that inaction and denial within ordinary life can contribute to worsening environmental problems. A different perspective emerges in Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide. Here, the domestic life is closely tied to survival within an ecologically fragile region. The communities of the Sundarbans depend on natural resources for their livelihoods, creating a direct relationship between household environment and environmental conditions. Fishing, resource use, and human settlement place pressures on the ecosystems. Yet these activities are often driven by necessity rather than excess consumption. This distinction is important because it complicates simple explanations of environmental responsibility. While some forms of ecological damage result from overconsumption, others emerge from the struggle for survival within vulnerable environments. Ghosh therefore encourages readers to consider the social and economic realities that shape environmental interactions. Taken together, both these novels demonstrate that domesticity contributes to environmental change in diverse ways. Consumption, denial, livelihood practices, and survival strategies all connect household life to broader ecological processes. The relationship between domestic life and environmental changes does not operate only in one direction. Just as household practices can influence the environment, environmental crises can profoundly affect households and communities. These novels illustrate how climate change reshapes everyday life, creating new forms of uncertainty and vulnerability. In The Stone Gods, the consequences of environmental destruction are visible on a planetary scale. Ecological collapse becomes so severe that entire societies are forced to abandon their planet in search of new places to inhabit. As a result, the idea of home itself becomes unstable. Domestic life, which is usually associated with security and permanence, is transformed into something temporary and uncertain. Through this portrayal, Winterson highlights one of the most profound consequences of environmental crisis: the loss of home and belonging. Barbara Kingsolver's flight behavior presents a more immediate and localized experience of climate change. The Turnbow family's livelihood is closely connected to the land, making them particularly vulnerable to environmental disruption. Changes in weather patterns and ecological conditions directly affect their economic stability and their daily lives. The novel illustrates how climate change often creates uncertainty for rural and working class households that depend heavily on natural systems for survival. An important insight offered by both these texts is that environmental change is rarely experienced equally. The ability to respond to ecological challenges often depends on social and economic circumstances. Some households possess greater resources and adaptability, while others face significant constraints. So, both the novels have demonstrated that climate change affects more than ecosystems alone. It influences livelihoods, security, stability, and the very meaning of home. So this issue becomes even more apparent in the two texts which are these, where the rapture and the hungry tide. The effects of climate change are not limited to physical or economic loss only. Environmental crises can also influence emotions, mental well-being, social relationships, and the patterns of community life. This dimension is particularly visible in the rapture and the hungry tide. In the rapture, ecological instability creates a pervasive atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. As environmental disasters become increasingly frequent, the sense of safety traditionally associated with home begins to weaken. The novel suggests that a climate crisis affects not only landscapes and infrastructure, but also the psychological conditions of individuals. Anxiety and insecurity and anticipation of catastrophe become part of everyday life. Through this portrayal, Jensen demonstrates that environmental crises have emotional and mental consequences that are just as significant as their physical effects. Similarly, in the hungry tide, the shift is towards communities living in environmentally vulnerable regions. The inhabitants of the Sundarbans face constant threats from flooding, storms, tidal changes, and conflicts with wildlife. These environmental pressures create conditions of uncertainty that affect livelihood, settlement patterns, and community stability. For many residents, displacement is not a distant possibility but an ongoing reality. The novel also highlights the issue of environmental injustice. Those who contribute least to global environment degradation frequently experience its most severe consequences. Marginalized communities often possess fewer resources to adapt to ecological changes, making them especially vulnerable to environmental disruptions. So both these texts reveal the unequal impact of climate change and the nature of climate crisis. While the environmental change affects societies across the world, its consequences are not distributed evenly. Social position, economic resources, and geographical location play an important role in determining how households and communities experience ecological instability. Now we come to the discussion of a different kind here, because the discussion so far has shown that households are deeply connected and are affected by the environmental changes. But at the same time, climate fiction encourages readers to examine how patterns of consumption and everyday practices may contribute to ecological degradation. In The Stone Gods, domestic life is strongly associated with consumer capitalism and technological dependence. The society depicted in the novel is built upon constant consumption, artificial environments, and the assumption that natural resources are endlessly available. Comfort and convenience become central values, while environmental limits are largely ignored. Winterson uses this setting to critique a culture in which excessive consumption is normalized. The novel suggests that when such habits become widespread, their cumulative impact can lead to a large-scale ecological destruction. A different perspective appears in flight behavior. Unlike the affluent and technologically driven society of the Stone Gods, the Turnbow household experiences economic hardships and limited opportunities. Their environmental impact is not primarily a result of excessive consumption, but is connected to farming practices, land use, and restricted access to scientific knowledge. Kingsolver therefore complicates simplistic explanation of environmental responsibility. The novel demonstrates that individuals often operate within larger social and economic systems that influence the choices available to them. This contrast between the two novels is particularly important. One critiques excess and consumerism, while the other highlights structural constraints and limited agency. Together, they encourage readers to think critically about the different ways household practices intersect with environmental issues. The remaining texts extend this discussion further by examining how denial, inaction, and survival-based resource use create additional ethical questions about environmental responsibilities. Now, here are some questions. Questions of environmental responsibility become even more complex in The Rapture and The Hungry Tide. These novels move beyond the issue of excessive consumption and examine how denial, inaction, and survival-based resource use contribute to ecological challenges. In The Rapture, one of the central concerns is society's tendency to maintain familiar routines despite growing signs of environmental crisis. Everyday life continues with a sense of normalcy even as ecological instability becomes increasingly visible. This disconnect reflects a broader ethical problem. People often recognize environmental risks but fail to take meaningful action. The novel therefore suggests that environmental degradation is not only caused by active exploitation of nature, but can also result from the passivity, denial, and the refusal to respond to warning signs. A different ethical dilemma emerges in The Hungry Tide. The communities living in the Sundarbans depend heavily on the natural resources for their survival. Fishing, forest use, and land-based livelihoods place pressure on fragile ecosystems. Yet, these activities are often necessary for sustaining everyday life. Unlike the excessive consumption critiqued in The Stone Gods, resource use in this context is driven by necessity rather than luxury. This distinction is important because it challenges simple notions of environmental responsibility. The novel raises difficult questions about the balance between ecological preservation and human survival. Can communities be expected to reduce their dependence on natural resources when those resources are essential to their livelihoods? How should environmental protection be pursued in regions where poverty and vulnerability remain pressing concerns? So, taken together, these texts demonstrate that environmental degradation cannot be explained through a single model of responsibility. Excess consumption, structural limitations, denial, and survival needs all shape the relationship between households and the environment in different ways. So, these complexities provide an excellent basis for reflection and debate. Let us conclude this lecture by considering a few discussion questions that bring together the key themes explored throughout our analysis. The questions that you can see on the screen are these. How do different forms of household consumption, that is excess versus survival, change our understanding of responsibility for climate change? Can individuals within households make sustainable choices? Or are they limited by larger social and economic systems? In which text do you find the most ethical tension between human needs and environmental preservation? And why? Do these novels suggest that change should begin at the domestic level or systemic global level? You need to explain your views. These questions are for you to ponder over, to contemplate, to brainstorm, and to revisit the points that have been discussed in this lecture by us. It will help you to find your own perspective, find your own understanding, find your own language, and find your own jargon to respond to what has been said by me. Because it's important to internalize these things as students of literature. It is important for all of us to have our own way of putting those same ideas or the same kinds of tropes in a different manner, in a different context. So I have used these references. I hope that will help you. So I hope you have enjoyed this discussion. I meet you in a different lecture. Thank you very much.